a researcher and industry expert in haptics and wearable technology. Today, I will discuss how businesses and also nonprofit organizations can benefit from haptics and XR field. We'll also talk about future of arts and technology. And today, my guest is Linda Ricci. Linda is a senior executive and a recognized thought leader in the VR, AR, XR, Metaverse space. And most recently, she is leading global strategic partnerships for the 150 million Meta Immersive Learning Fund. Linda is also an artist in the XR space, having her work featured at Burning Man VR, Web XR Awards, and XR Women. Hello, Linda.
Hi.
How are you today?
Good. Thank you for having me, Yulia.
And thank you for your time joining us and having this. I'm really excited about this conversation with you. I was thinking maybe we could start by talking about your passion for XR because you have so much experience in this field. Could you please share your passion, how it started actually? Why XR, why Metaverse?
Yeah, it started way before there was a word called Metaverse, actually. When I was applying for grad school in the late 80s, because I was 3. I keep making that joke and nobody laughs. I was not 3. I don't remember, to be perfectly honest, how I knew about VR at the time. I know I heard about it. I was in school in Europe and I was obsessed. The idea of world building and the idea of experimenting with different gravities and different environments and like what life would come from that. I really wanted to explore world building. I mean, I don't even know if it was called world building at the time. All I know is I typed it on my grad school application, sent it off on a piece of paper. And of course I don't have a copy of what I wrote, but I've been obsessed kind of with that thought ever since then. And then in 1994, I was in Hanover at CeBIT. And Silicon Graphics had a whole hall at the time. There's 26 halls. It was massive. And there was a guy on a stage, on a round stage, up on a podium, and he had what probably fits in our pocket in terms of computing power. But at the time, it was, a whole bunch of rows of computers, and he had a big screen, and he was doing 3D graphics. And I just remember I stood there for like hours, and I'm like, that's what I want to get involved in. I had absolutely no idea how to get involved with it. I got my MBA in Holland. I was living and working there. I knew nothing about what was happening in California at the time. This was pre-internet. So I just remember it was a long time coming. And then I actually ended up carving out a career doing business strategy consulting for companies that were dealing with emerging tech, either impacting on their markets or something internally they had to stay competitive. And so I was a hired gun around innovation, essentially, and helping them understand what the impact was for them, that meant in terms of markets, products, distribution, partnerships, all that stuff. And then in 2017, actually, I decided, all right, XR is finally commercial enough, mass commercial enough that I'm just going to stop being a innovation for hire, kind of any innovation, and I want to focus on the XR space. I ended up doing a TEDx talk around virtual reality and grassroots movements and how I think social VR is really going to help people connect across the world.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a question about that one later.
And kind of just taken off from there. So I ended up at Meta last year doing global partnerships for the Immersive Learning Fund. They are spending an awful lot of money to make sure that people around the world are trained in how to make 3D graphics in XR so that there's a next generation of people who are ready. And then I ended up being a board member on the Virtual World Society and things like that. So I've just jumped all into the industry for the last 5 years, I guess, now. And I absolutely adore it. I mean, I found my tribe after all these years.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Interesting stuff. Very interesting. So you kind of observed the beginnings, right? And all the way till now. There will be so many new things coming, right?
Well, it's funny because some of it's not so new. So Second Life was around. I was working with clients about launching into Second Life and Fortune 200s back in 2009, I believe. And then 10 years before that, I was helping do the first generation of internet agencies. I was working at one of the largest ones in New York at the time before 9/11. And there was a big tech crash months before 9/11 anyway in New York. But I love the space where it's all still kind of the Wild West, where you're figuring it all out, because it tends to attract the really smart people with the really creative work. So a lot of this stuff reminds me of the early days of the internet, actually.
Okay, so you mentioned, well, let's talk about Wild West from the
Yep.
technology from the technology
Less,
perspective.
yes, increasingly less
Well,
so, but yes, yes.
so what I wanted to ask you, I know that, I mean, you are in this emerging tech, XR field. When you think about these areas, it's still mostly about kind of visual slash maybe audio modality, right? If we think about sensory systems that are involved, right, when we interact with this tech. But I know for this particular podcast, you were actually interested to talk about touch and haptic
Yes.
technology, right? So I was wondering why specifically touch, especially considering that you were involved mostly with, I would say, visual modalities, right?
Yes. Although I've been an artist my entire life, and I've worked with hot glass and ceramics, and I was a metalsmith for many years. I think a sense of touch is super important, especially as humans. I mean, what set us apart in the beginning and why we evolved is because we use tools. So
Mm-hmm.
we evolved to touch and feel and use our hands. So I think that that is one aspect of VR or XR that I'm looking forward to having develop more. There's very much a lack of it right now. I mean, there's Tesla suits and there's haptics gloves, but it's difficult still. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not ubiquitous, and everybody focuses on the experience in terms of vision, but they don't focus on the experience in terms of taste and touch and smell. I know people are working on the smell aspect of it too. So I think
Mm-hmm.
to complete the experience, you need to be able to pick up something and feel that resistance. You need to be able to, if you bump into them, or feel they have a welding app where you can teach yourself welding. And I am so curious how you do that without the actual haptic, because it's all about touch when you create things. So that's why I wanted to be here for this, because I just thought it was such an interesting area to explore. And it's so early days still with that stuff, and still not possible in so many ways.
Right, that's why I mentioned Wild West.
Yeah.
Of kind of XR and haptics would be, I mean, in addition to, of course, our olfactory and
Yeah.
other sensory systems that we have and explore, like, for example, smell, right? But from your perspective, how can industry, and maybe you can also name maybe type of industry, can benefit from haptic technology specifically, or haptic feedback if we add it to experiences of people? Like, what are the main things that you find beneficial?
Okay, so this is a couple years ago. There was an entire, from a distance, somebody could pick up their object, and then you would feel a vibration, and they would know you love them and all that stuff. I'm not talking about what we think we're talking about.
Besides massage aspects and other.
I'm talking about affection and emotion, not sex. But teledildonics, let's just say, has been around for quite some time, where
Mhm.
two partners that are in a virtual world can interact with feedback and with gadgets. So I think that's one area that's actually been around for quite a while. I mean, I think I was talking about it 13 or 14 years ago already, right? So it's been around. It's just not
So
mainstream.
it's not so emerging, right? So maybe we can like
It's also
think
not
about what emerging fields.
like most
Huh?
people don't know that exists. I think the concept of being able to, because we can meet in a space from afar visually, right? And that sense of embodiment that you're actually there is instant, right? You actually feel like you're talking to somebody. I actually dated somebody in Second Life. He lived on the West Coast, I lived on the East Coast, and so we used to go into Second Life together and hang out as avatars. And it feels like you're sitting there with that person, but you can't touch them. You can't feel, they put their hand on your face or anything like that. So I think that's the area that still needs to be explored. I think this social aspect of VR, the connection part of VR, that it eliminates distance even more than visual. Like, we can talk on Zoom, but it's not like you're in my room and I'm with you somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the part of touch, I think, is
Like a sense of presence, right? So a
yeah.
sense of presence would be one of the promising areas, yeah.
Yes.
Comparing use case. Well, now I'm kind of next to this TED talk of yours somewhat in my thoughts, because I was really impressed with this presentation of yours where you talked about how XR can help with grassroots initiatives, right? And how they can make this initiative more compelling to people to relate to, etc. Maybe you can talk more about this, just a brief overview of that, and then hypothetically your kind of thought about XR and grassroots initiatives and haptics, adding haptics. If we add haptics into this experience, can it help, and how again?
I think the world has increasingly been flattening for 100 years, right? It was first it was Pony Express, then it was telegraph, then it was telephone. right? And we've increasingly been able to connect with people immediately. I think VR and AR and VR are the next generation of that spatial computing, where we actually, like I said, have a sense of body. We can be with somebody in 3D. So the next generation of that is being able to actually interact with them more naturally, which includes touch. So for the TED Talk, I talked about the flattening of the world and how, you might care deeply about something and somebody else might care deeply about that, but they're on the other side of the planet. And with VR, you can actually find your tribe even more so than social media has done. Back when we were doing the internet stuff in the early days, we used to talk about somebody who made coats for goats, right? You are the only person who makes coats for goats, but all of a sudden you find out through the internet and that there are other people, and then all of a sudden you have a group, and there's positive and negatives, as we've seen with that. But with VR, you actually have that sense of presence and that sense of community, and you can have a virtual community and connect people from all over the globe around things that you care about, right? So grassroots movements about planting trees, grassroots movements around political things. You can join, in theory, not yet live streaming VR, but we're getting there. You can join that protest that's happening in China or wherever. But again, I think those are pale experiences if you can't actually hold up that banner and feel the wind, or if you can't feel the group when you're in a group, how that feels like to stand with a bunch of people.
Like immersion, right?
Right. So I think that's what the grassroots movements aspect of it is you'll be able to connect on a much more deeper level than you can through social media and words. And especially with the instant translation that's now out, which has been coming for ages too, been waiting for that one forever, where you can just talk and language is no longer a barrier. And all of a sudden you can talk to people from different countries and find out that they are doing they care deeply about deforestation. You care deeply about deforestation. There's deforestation in Brazil. There's deforestation here. And all of a sudden you've got a group of people and you can meet with them. So I think that it'll fuel grassroots movements because it'll cause that connection to come much more quickly and much more intensely than we have now. Now it's a Facebook group and we got keyboard warriors who piss you off and they leave the group. It's an opportunity to connect and create a virtual community that is actually only really virtual technically, because it feels like the real thing when you're in it. And the haptics part is being able to feel, I think, more part of that, again, that sense of touch, that sense of I could plant a virtual tree, I can feel that thing growing, I can feel the earth, I can whatever your grassroots movement is, you can interact with people in a much more natural manner and find
right.
people who are like-minded.
It's actually, for me, it was super interesting to kind of think about this use case of grassroots and kind of maybe some more social rights issues that we can bring closer to people. Because essentially it's about building empathy, right? So we want to have more people on board. And how do we do that? Yes, we can show compelling pictures, right? Some emotional images. We can make them listen to stuff, right?
It's very mental. It's very mental.
All these are very important things, right?
It's very mental though, but you can't experience it. So Greenpeace actually has a boat and they are doing VR. This is not, they've done this for like 2-3 years now, but they have a boat that they send to the Antarctic and you're on the boat, you see the melting ice, you're part of that boat. You're going with them, literally going with them, right? I mean, I used a bunch of, Greenpeace was in there in that example. There's a couple others that I used. But I think it's an enormously powerful tool to be able to tell your story as a not even just
in these particular cases, right?
Yeah, not even a nonprofit necessarily. It's as a human who cares about something, you can communicate that in ways verbal is only one tiny part of our communication. There's so many other ways that we communicate with nonverbal cues, all kinds of things. So I think that VR helps bring that along, so it tells a 360 story.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree, because if I'm talking just about, because I'm in haptics, so I'm kind of biased always haptics, and it's always kind of difficult to bring very compelling new use cases for haptics, right? Yes, VR space and fine, but what for, right? And the main kind of use case is gaming.
Always.
For me personally, it's boring. I mean, it's too commercial, to kind of boring in a way. And even though it's a big industry, obviously.
I'm not a gamer, believe it or not. I never game ever, but I don't
Me
need,
neither. I think I should be
yeah,
from the experimental point of view.
exactly. And I don't need to feel shot. That's okay. Or kicked or any of that stuff. But I do love the idea for a doctor not only to do, practice on VR surgery and practice on operating on that tiny little heart, but actually feel what it's like to do it so that the practice and the training feels real, right? There's, commercial enterprise applications for all these things. Everybody immediately goes to games and consumer, but in fact, the enterprise is where a lot of the focus is right now on the money, training, education, empathy, soft skills training, hard skills training, right? And all of those can be much enhanced if you can actually feel what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, this is a really amazing case, which is super, super compelling, and haptics could be really part of it. Because in a nutshell, yes, it's a sense of presence, like overarching kind of objective, but then sense of presence for what makes a huge, huge difference, right? Because you will approach the design aspects or design space of this technology in a very specific way. If your use case is social cause versus gaming, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So I find it super, super interesting. It's a bad word for this case, but it's really worth exploring further, I would say, from research or any other angle. So really thank you for bringing it up. But with that, as we go with developing emerging tech and specifically haptics, let's say, what challenges do you predict with integrating haptics in XR space?
Well,
Maybe some ethical considerations or anything you think of?
I'm sure you've seen more than I have, but I've seen a few variations of how to engineer it. And it's, it's either water or it's air or it's electric shocks or whatever, but you need to still cover everything to get that feeling there. And I think it'd be great if we could weave things into fabrics and that are light and easy to wear, and you could somehow feel. I think, manufacturing resistance. I've seen a couple theoretical, interesting approaches, but again, that sense of water bladders that make it feel like you're pushing against something. I mean, you know more about the engineering than I do. I think that the problem is that, and we're talking full immersion.
You can also talk about societal implications, not just design or engineering implications.
Yeah. Well, it's expensive and it's difficult, and only a few people will be able to have it.
Correct.
But that's true of any. We're talking, iPhones, cell phones are expensive. Like the digital divide is getting wider and wider. People who have access to these things, and the next generation of skills that it requires to use them, right? So that's part of what the virtual world is talking about. I think we're talking about a digital divide that's only going to get wider as the technology gets more complicated to access, but they're also critical skills for the future. So it's very important that everybody gets a chance to understand how to use them, especially with AI in the mix and AI driving interaction. Because I always describe AI as the interaction layer that fuels the interaction layer, and XR is the actual how you interact with somebody, right? So AI is the driver. It's the natural language, it's the data, it's it's everything that makes it work. And that's one of the things the Virtual World Society is addressing or trying to address, is that communities of people will be left behind if they don't have access to these technologies and understand how to use them, and they're critical skills for the future. So I think in terms of haptics, it's just really hard to get a good haptic. It's expensive. It requires full immersion. It requires putting on I couldn't try the Tesla suit at the CES because I'm 6 feet tall. They didn't have a size for me. I mean, all these things you need to think about. I understand that the challenges with developing like a full body suit, but I mean, it's a full on, suit, and then this, and then the gloves, and then the wires, and the headset, and every step of that is a barrier to adoption. Right.
Right.
So anybody could develop something that was small and still had the same impact, or at least partially the same. It would be easy. It has to be easy, otherwise people aren't going to use it.
Very good point. When you talk about haptics, it's kind of, people are expecting touch, and when they think about touch, they think about real touch.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to recreate it from many perspectives,
yeah,
including form factor, as you just mentioned.
Yeah. Well, there's touch, and then there's resistance, right? So there's two. There's when you pick up something that's hard and you feel that
right, that's a different one.
Right, so that's touch, or that's resistance and then touch. And those are two different things. I mean, I've demoed the, everything that's out there at this point, but it's work. It's not easy. I don't know how they're going to make it. I'm not an engineer, so I'm not sure how they're going to make it easy. I know I'm a judge at the MIT Hackathon, and they had some haptics companies there last year. And they were talking about, they always do things that are in beta at the hackathon, like things that aren't quite out yet, because they want to see how people do them. And they were talking about electrical signals, like, through your hands, you could feel things like that. I mean, it's all kinds of, it's not external, that's internal, but that's kind of, creepy, electrical things through your head.
Scared to try. Scared to try.
That one I didn't get to, but I mean, all of that. They ended up, there was a couple participants who actually developed stuff for for people with sight challenges, and it was like a sensing where something was, and it was through the haptic gloves that it was getting feedback, it was sensing the barriers. It was very cool. They were navigating by feel, essentially. It was a stronger signal every time they got closer to a solid object in VR kind of thing. But
well, actually, we can learn a lot from people who are blind or low vision people. We can actually learn a lot from them about our abilities to perceive haptic feedback, and our abilities are quite right. So there are some limitations, of course, especially in comparison to like visual modality, but we have quite a lot of abilities. So there is potential, but there are also like design constraints that you just talked about. But we are moving forward slower than visual-based applications, obviously. But I know you're an artist, right? So you do very interesting work and VR experiences. And you told me that the background that you have now is actually your art piece. Maybe you can talk about it a little bit, and we could conclude also our conversation on this artistic point, because I think it's also, I just want to mention, because you work in industry, but at the same time you're artists. It's very challenging actually to combine these two, and I really admire people like you who are like trying and pushing towards their passion.
I can't not do art. However broke I ever was, however small the place I ever lived, wherever I was creating something. I can't not. It's a compulsion and an obsession, and it gets in the way sometimes because I have spent all the time and money. I started in high school. I was in love with medieval manuscripts, believe it or not. So I started doing calligraphy and gilding, gold letters, all that stuff. That segued into stained glass, of course, because that's related, colors. Then I went from that to hot glass, and I started melting it all in different ways. And then I got tired of buying the metal components, and so I started learning how to do metal, and I became a metalsmith.
Actually, a very interesting direction of art. Usually, you start with some painting here and there.
No,
but you went to this very unique, like very specific.
I love 3D. I've always loved sculpture more than illustration. I've always loved feeling and having sculpting, right? So my hands. And then since then, it's morphed into ceramics, and which is very messy, and textiles. I do textile dyeing and all that too. I mean, I've done just about everything at this point, but I think there's a lot of transferable skills. Parallel to all of that, I was doing computer graphics. So what's funny is I think I bring a lot of that aesthetic into my art. So there's a lot of gold and glass and gemstones sometimes, but I've always been obsessed with computer graphics, and whatever the computer graphics were at the time, I was making the computer crunch and crash, because that's what I do. So 15 years ago, I taught myself CAD so that I could launch a jewelry company, which I did. And I outsourced the manufacturing, and I did the design, and I also did regular metal smithing, but you can't scale so easily. And I wanted to scale. 3D printed the prototypes, outsourced manufacturing as a proper company. But then when VR, in 2017, exactly, I said, I tried to start doing VR and realized that it was a completely different kind of 3D. So I had to start learning how to do the VR stuff, which is completely different, and AR. So I've been obsessively playing with that for a couple of years now, loving it.
You've been doing a lot of, I would say, interesting on an edgy type of arts, right? So, and you had quite a long stretch of developing different skills. At this moment in time, where do you see, how do you project the future of art combined with tech? Maybe you can also think about haptic tech.
I've been playing a lot. Yeah, I've been playing a lot with AI generative art. I call it conjuring. I don't call it creating, but I love it. It's another way to be creative, and that makes me happy. I'm not picky. I think I wouldn't want to be a commercial artist right now, because I think, it in terms of being an advertising or commercial artist, where you're creating something to a brief for a client for a distinct purpose, AI creation is very easy to do that, and you won't need nearly the teams, and you'll have 100 times the output. I've seen some really interesting work. I think the next generation is 3D AI, so AI creating, I've been playing with that for about a year now. As much as there is out there, it's not that much yet, but it's coming. And I saw another announcement that there's another one coming now today. So there is a development in that direction, I think.
So you think 3D art will be prominent?
Well, I think it's hard to make VR and AR right now, right? It's hard. It takes, there's multiple programs you have to learn. It's hard. It's a lot of work to learn. And I happen to love that, but it's not easy. I think when we get to the stage where people can just use words to create 3D environments, it'll drive content. And once we have content, we'll have more people in VR. And I think that's a good thing. I think that, you can either fight it or you can join it, and it's going to happen. So you might as well learn how to do it and integrate it into parts of other things. I think, as with anything, artists take stuff and they start to learn how to do it, and then they come up with ways to use it that nobody thought of before. We're having an AOL kind of a moment, where a MySpace moment, where everybody's going to create their own, 3D space from prompts. A lot of people are very angry about that. I see it as another tool, and also I see it as removing barriers to being creative. So there's people who've never been artists who are all of a sudden being able to communicate through pictures what they have in their heads. And so all of a sudden, all these people are being creative when they couldn't be before, because it takes all this time to learn how to do things. So I think that may be a good thing. It's going to be a lot more people being creative.
It's also about accessibility, right? Sharing it,
Yeah. All of a sudden, you don't need to spend 3 years learning Blender and Unity. You can just start doing it, right? So it's a shortcut to creation. And I think, we need to get more people involved in creating this stuff, and then more people will want to do it too, because we still have, we haven't reached the tipping point in terms of mass adoption where it's just so ubiquitous. I call it escape velocity. Our industry has not reached escape velocity yet, where when there's a downturn, we don't think about, well, is it going to survive? All those articles that are, you think the metaverse is going to survive? Like, nobody does that about cell phones when there's a recession, right? It's achieved escape velocity. It's so ubiquitous. Televisions, radios, all the cars, right? Nobody questions, are they going to be around next year? When there's a downturn, I want to see our industry reach that escape velocity point where it's just so ubiquitous. But to do that, we need people who are involved, more people involved, not just the people who are, this is a relatively small group still. And yes, mostly gamers, but there's other stuff too, right? There's so much else you can do there.
Like what?
Well, the social aspect is for me the strongest. I think what I said before about being able to connect, I think that's the attraction of XR, is being able to connect. I have relatives all over the world. I'm rebuilding the house I grew up in VR so that we can have parties there like we used to. We're going to have VR parties. I haven't finished it. I'm about 60% of the way there. I still got some stuff to finish, but I showed it to my mom, and we sold the house 20 years ago, and she's all like, "Oh my God, like it looks so real." I'm like, "Yeah, it does, right?" I mean,
that's so cool,
powerful, right? And then my relatives in Holland, my relatives in other countries, we can all join in there together, and that's the social aspect of VR that I think is so strong. I love creating in VR. So, I mean, I create in VR. I use a program that's now not supported anymore, but Adobe Medium, which I love. It's sculpting, and in VR, you're standing there, you're doing it, you're walking around it. It's just like a piece of clay without the cold, wet aspect of clay, because I was very messy and it was always cold and wet. But again, it enables so much. So those are two things I think VR is fantastic. We're also exploring things, traveling. Things that you can't do so easily.
So from what I feel, what you're describing, it's more of an experience, right, than art in our classical way of kind of seeing art. So it feels like art goes into this experiential phase, right? So it's not just like an object, an artifact that is hanging on the wall of a museum that you can touch. You have to be so careful about it, but it's more about like some immersive experiences that we all can be part of.
Right. Well, in terms of haptics again, or touch, or experiencing feeling, right? The feeling when you're actually there. I would love, it'll happen someday. We're going to not have television, or we might still have TV, but on top of it, we'll have the Starship Enterprise, Star Trek person, can be, mapped to my actual room, and I can be sitting in the middle of the set, and then we have like theater in the round, and I can go around and sit in the command chair, or things can happen around me, right? So on entertainment, the next generation of entertainment, and it's not haptics per se, but I think haptics plays a really important role in all of that, because you need to be able, like I said, to sit, to feel, to interact with, and interacting we do with our hands, right? We talk,
right, but it's also about recreating the experiences using haptics. This is like a big area and direction, right, in terms of like experiences. But I'm wondering, I'm also curious myself personally, because I really like art in general, whether haptics or haptic tech, right? Not haptics is a big word, right? It involves also sense of touch, which can be, conveyed through a table, right? So it doesn't have to be interactive in that way. But I'm thinking about more interactive, haptic technology that can be used to create art objects, not necessarily just to recreate experiences like a sensation of our arm or some sort of object or a chair or softness or roughness, but be a standalone piece of art, like abstract, something that you can touch or whatever.
Like a sensory chamber. So you could
sound like a sensory artifact.
Yeah, you could stand in the middle of an installation, but you don't see it. But like a blind person, depending on where your hand goes, you could feel the surfaces and the softness and the hardness, and actually have an experience that has to do with touching and mapping that sense without the visual feedback. That'd be really interesting, actually.
Yeah, actually, I'm always in search, like whenever I'm in some new place, or like in New York, for instance, I'm always searching like for a gallery that has some sort of touch-based artifacts. There are very few of them. Once I've been actually in Tallinn, in Estonia. There was this black room. Basically, you go, it's a dark room. You don't see anything. You can only touch things. They were not interactive in a way of how, like, technology-wise, right? Nothing vibrates or gives you force feedback or anything, but just objects that you can touch. But still, it was already something interesting. A new experience.
Yeah, you've got me thinking, because I think it'd be fabulous to have sound and haptics be the only interaction. So if you touch something, it has a tone. Like, can you play various sounds depending on how you touch it, where you touch it, and you do that without visual input, and you're kind of standing in the middle of like a synthesizer almost, but one that's based on you interacting with it, not looking at it. That'd be cool. That'd be really
well fun. Maybe you can start doing it.
Let's just do it. I like that idea.
Exactly. Let's get together and do it.
Yeah, that's
why not? I would love to. I mean, I'm really, it's also my kind of a big, some sort of wish aside from my research activities to do something more artistic. So who knows? But I think we are kind of about to finish in terms of our timing. Even though we were able, I think, to cover quite a big range of topics, starting from industry to art, quite a big stretch of things. So I really appreciate your kind of, sharing all this knowledge and experience our audience. So
thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. It's fun. Let's make an installation together.
Exactly. I would love that.
I know. I'm like, I got thinking. Interesting.
So thanks a lot.